Welcome back to Information Systems and Cybersecurity 375. I'm really enjoying this class this semester. Thank you for all the emails that you've sent this week. You've had some really good questions. I'm really excited about your projects, and I'm looking forward to seeing what you've given me. So I hope that those are going well. In the last lecture, we talked about cascading style sheets and how we could use them to do page layout, how to position elements at different places on the page. In this lecture, we're going to look at how we can use CSS to do some more advanced things. And in particular, we're going to look at some of the features provided by the new CSS standard released in 2014, CSS version 3. But before we talk about that, I wanted to address a question that's come up in some of the emails. And that's about citing sources. Now, citing your sources is really important. If you're going to use a resource that you find on the web, whether it's an image that you use or maybe a cascading style sheet that you're going to link to, or perhaps you've looked up some kind of style rule and you're going to put that in your CSS file, which is a good idea. By the way, you're welcome to use CSS in your lab. And in general, if you want to work ahead a little bit and use things we haven't talked about in your projects, that's just fine. In fact, that's a good way to earn points toward glitter in the creative section of your project. But if you use a resource online, you need to cite it properly. And the best way to do that is to put a comment in your code. And that comment should go as close to the place where you use it as possible. So if you have an image file, right above the image tag, you should put a little comment that says, this image is from, and then the URL where you got it from. Now, we haven't talked yet about how to do that. So here's how you can add comments to your code. It turns out that you actually have to do this differently in HTML than you do in CSS. In HTML, the way that we add a comment is we embed a special tag into the file. And that tag is ignored by the web browser. It's a tag that starts with a left angle bracket, an exclamation point, and then 2 dashes. So here I have an example. Left angle bracket, bang. In computer science, we call an exclamation point a bang. Dash, dash. This is a comment. Now, of course, you'd put your own text there, image from or whatever. And then we close the comment with dash, dash, and a greater than or a right angle bracket. If you want to put a comment into your style sheet, into your cascading style sheets code, then it's a little bit different. We don't use a tag to show that something's a comment. Instead, we do what's called C-style commenting. And the way that works is you put a /, an asterisk, or a star, and then your comment, and then you close your comment with a star and a /. The /, just in case you get it confused with a backslash, the / is the one that's on the question mark key. It's the one that goes from bottom left to top right, like we have here. So /* to begin a comment, */ to end a comment. Very easy to use comments in CSS. And by the way, we'll be able to use this kind of comment in JavaScript too when we get there later in the course. So Cascading Style Sheet version 2 came out in 1998, which is a long time ago now. That's not quite 20 years, but it's quite a while. And it needed some updating. So they released 2.1 to kind of update some of the things, but they didn't want to break compatibility with stuff, so they didn't make any major changes. And they started working on a new version of CSS, CSS 3, that was finally ready to be released in 2014. And it's a great addition to the Cascading Style Sheet standard. It adds a whole bunch of new selectors, but it also adds some properties for things like animation, transformation, and for doing layout. And so we're going to talk about those new properties. But unfortunately, there's a problem with that, and that's that they're still a little bit experimental. CSS 3 support is better in some web browsers than others. And it'll turn out that some of the properties they added in the CSS 3 don't work at all in some web browsers. They work great in others, and they're sort of in an experimental state in some of the other web browsers. So we've got kind of 3 classes. We've got properties that work great, properties that don't work at all, and properties that work, but we have to do a little bit of fussing to make them work. And what I like about this is that in CSS 3, they've created a way that you can handle that. So the idea is, if you have an experimental feature that your web browser supports, but it's not considered ready for prime time, what they do, before they introduce it as a normal, typical CSS rule, is they introduce it as an experimental feature by putting a little prefix in front of the name of the property. So in Mozilla or Firefox browsers, that prefix is going to be -mos-. For Chrome and Safari and mobile browsers like the Kindle browser that rely on the WebKit engine, you can say -WebKit-. Internet Explorer or Microsoft Echo or whatever they're calling it now just uses -MS for Microsoft. And Opera is -O, except that I think recent versions of Opera now use WebKit, so it's -WebKit- for more recent versions of Opera. But what you can do is, if you have an experimental feature, you can put in a rule with one of these prefixes, and that'll turn it on, even though it's not really ready for prime time yet. So for example, suppose that I want to have a rule that uses the border radius property. The border radius property allows us to take a rectangle and give it rounded corners, basically. And so we can say, okay, give the corners of this rectangle a quarter-inch radius. So here I've got a rule that's going to do that to H1 tags. So whenever I have an H1 tag, I'm going to give it maybe a background color and stuff to style it, but I'm also going to give it this border radius of 1/4 inch. And it's a new feature, so not all browsers support it, but if they follow the CSS standard, browsers that don't support it will just ignore it. However, if they have experimental support for border radius, they won't turn it on by default when they see this rule, but we can tell them to turn it on by adding the prefixed version of the rule. So we can say -Moz -border radius and set that to 1/4 inch, and now on Firefox, if they have support for the border radius, then it'll work. So this will work on Firefox, and it'll work on fully standards compliant browsers. If we want to turn this on for other browsers that haven't released it yet but have it in sort of an experimental state, we can add those prefixes. So for example, for Internet Explorer, we can say -MS, we can add Opera support, and we can throw a WebKit support in like this. And so what happens is that in order to get the border radius, we actually have to throw in all, 5 of these? We have to do the 4 prefixes plus the border radius, and now we can be sure that the border radius will be on if the web browser supports it at all. It may look kind of funny on some of these ones that don't have proper support for it, but it should do something. So what would this look like? Here I've got all these prefixes, and I've got the border radius, and I'm going to apply that to a web page, and I've just given you the body of the web page here. I've got an H1 header that says, interesting header with a rounded border, and then underneath that I have a paragraph just to make it a little bit more interesting. And I'm also going to set the background color of my H1 tag to green. I'm going to set the font color, or just the color, to white. I'm going to set the border to be 1 pixel thick, and it'll be a solid blue border, and I'm going to center the text. So it looks like this, interesting header with a rounded border, and this happens to be in Firefox, and so now it works. So that's kind of neat, but what are the different experimental properties that we can try out? Well, let's talk first about transformations. So when we talked about layout, we talked about the position property and the float property, and those allowed us to position things on the page, but they didn't give us a lot of control. And if we want to be able to do animations, for example, and move things around on the page, we need to have more control than just float this to the left. And so we can do that with CSS3 transformations. And the transformations are going to allow us to actually do 4 things. We can move things, we can rotate them, we can resize them, and there's actually a 4th thing we can do called skewing that I'm not going to talk about in this lecture, but skewing is available, and it's a transformation that you can apply. So why do we want to use transformations? So we could just use CSS2 positioning techniques, which is great for static elements that don't move. But it has a couple drawbacks. First of all, it doesn't allow rotation. So if we want to draw things at like an angle or something, we can't do that in CSS2. It also doesn't allow easy scaling. If we want to be able to draw something scaled up or scaled down, there's no easy way to do that in CSS2. Users can zoom in on the page in their browser and blow everything up or shrink everything, but we don't have a way to take, say, an image and rotate it, and then maybe put some text on top of it and shrink the text down to an appropriate size. We just can't do that in the code. Also, with CSS2, we can only position elements on even pixel boundaries. So the screen is broken up into little tiny rectangles called pixels, and we can position things one pixel at a time. And even if we use dimensional elements like inches and centimeters, when we actually draw it on the screen, CSS is going to draw it on pixel boundaries. That's great if we have elements that don't move, but if we're trying to animate, we want smooth animations. And so if we are trying to move something at an angle, we're going to do some calculations, maybe some sines and cosines, to try to figure out where to draw things. And they're not going to be smooth because they're going to kind of jerk pixel to pixel to pixel. And so as we zoom in, it's going to get blockier and blockier. It's not going to be nice. But with CSS3 transformations, we can actually position elements on sub-pixel boundaries, which will give us nice smooth animations. So CSS3 transformations are best for animation. And they're going to allow translation, which means to move something from one place to another, rotation, and scaling, as well as other operations. I think I mentioned skewing already. You can also do what's called a perspective transformation, where you take a three-dimensional object and project it onto your two-dimensional screen. So if you're interested in doing 3D stuff in CSS3, that's available. I'm not going to cover that in this lecture either. That's a little bit beyond the scope of the course. So all of this is done with one CSS3 property, the transform property. So we're going to have rules that say transform : and then something. So what can we do? Well, the first thing we can do is translation. We can move an element from one position on the page to another using the translate method. So what this does is if an element would have been drawn at this location, we can say draw it at this location instead, or slide it over here instead. And so that's going to be useful. It's a lot like relative positioning in CSS2, but it gives us a little bit more control. So here I have a box, and it has ID set to box 1. And I'm going to translate it 300 pixels to the right and 30 pixels up. So notice we have the sort of the x coordinate first and then the y coordinate. So we're going to take it where it is, and we're going to translate it 300 pixels in the x, along the x-axis, and then negative 30 pixels means that we're going to move it up 30 pixels along the y-axis. So that's how this works. And so I'm going to have several of these boxes that I use for examples. So I've put them all into a box class, and I have a rule .box that will match everything in a box class. And I'm setting the background color to blue, the width to 2 inches, the margin to 0, and I'm giving it 1/4 inches of padding. So if I were to render 3 boxes, this is what it would look like. Box number 1 has been translated 300 pixels to the right and 30 pixels up. Now you can see it's been translated 300 pixels to the right because it doesn't line up with the other 2 boxes. Can you tell that it's been moved 30 pixels up? Well, ordinarily it would be between the other 2 boxes, but if you look closely, you can see that it's actually overlapping a little bit with the one on the left. So it's actually been moved up too. So that's 300, negative 30, and I did that with a transform : translate rule. I can also rotate. I can rotate elements by specifying an angle in degrees. The angle is a clockwise angle. I think 0 is straight up, and it's sort of like the face of a clock. So 90 degrees would be to the straight to the right, 180 degrees would be down, 270 degrees would be a rotation all the way to the left, and then 360 would put us right back where we started. But that's sort of what's happening here. So again, I have my box class. It hasn't changed. Blue background, white font, width 2 inches. But now I'm going to apply a different transformation to box 1. I'm going to transform it 2 ways. I'm going to translate it 300 pixels to the right, and this time I'm only going to move it up 20 pixels, and then I'm going to rotate it by 45 degrees clockwise. And so it looks like that. I think the reason I changed it from 30 up to 20 up is because it chopped off too much of it. You couldn't see that other corner. I can also scale elements, so I can make them different sizes. So here I'm going to transform the box by translating it 600 pixels to the right and 20 pixels up. And then I'm also going to scale it. So I'm going to scale it different ways in the different dimensions. I'm going to scale it so that it's only 80% of its width in the x direction. So horizontally, it's going to shrink. It's going to be 80% of its original size. But in the vertical dimension, I'm going to more than double it. I'm going to multiply the height by 2.5 times. So if you look at the graphic below, you can see that I've done that. Boxes 2 and 3 are still skinny little boxes, but now box 1 is not as wide, but it's very tall. So that's really cool. We can also do what are called transitions, and this is a way that we can actually have an animation. So one way to do that is to use the transform property inside a hover element. Remember, there's a special selector that we talked about for links in a previous lecture. We said we could do like a:hover, and that rule would apply to an a tag, a link, when the mouse was hovering over it. Well, it turns out with CSS3, you can apply :hover to other things, including an h1 tag. So here I've got an h1 tag, and it's going to apply this transform property only when the mouse is over the box. And in this case, I'm going to transform it by scaling it by a factor of 2 in all dimensions. So it's going to be twice as wide and twice as tall, but only when I put the mouse over it. So it looks kind of like that. Now, if I do that, it'll do it instantly when I hover over it. If I want to have a slower animation that they can actually see, maybe I want the box to like explode or expand and shrink again when you move the mouse off of it, then I can use the transition property. So the transition property talks about which property should change and how long it should take. So here I've got an h1 rule, and what properties am I going to apply to that h1 rule? Well, first I'm going to set the initial width to be 100 pixels. I'm going to set the margin to 0 auto. That's that margin auto trick that centers it in the middle of the page. I'm going to set the text alignment to be centered, so the text box will show up in the middle. I'm setting the background color to blue, the color to white, and then I'm going to set a transition property. And notice on WebKit browsers like Chrome, this is an experimental feature, so you have to say -webkit-transition : and then also below just say transition : So here I've got transition : and then it says width to S. Now what that means is that I'm going to change the width, and when I change the width, it's going to take a total of 2 seconds. And then I have the h1 hover property below, and I set the width to 200 pixels. So what's going to happen is when I hover, the width will change, and my transition property says that when the width changes, slow that down so it takes 2 seconds to change. So it's going to slowly expand from 100 pixels to 200 pixels over the course of 2 seconds. So the syntax of the transition property is that it actually can take 4 different arguments. You've seen here 2. It took a property and a duration. The property was width and the duration was 2 seconds. But in addition to taking a property and a duration, we can actually give it a timing function so that instead of just being an even 2 seconds, it can go really fast and then slow down, or it can start slow and speed up as different parts of the animation. And then we can also add a delay so that it doesn't start right away. So what are some of the different transition timing functions? You can either set these by putting them as part of the transition tag, or you can set them separately, transition-timing function. This is sort of like how we could set the margin, or we could set the margin-left and the margin-right and the margin-top and the margin-bottom all separately. So what are the different functions? Well, there's linear, which means just constant speed. That's the default. Or you can do ease in. Ease in starts slow and then goes fast. There's ease out, which is fast and then slow. There's also just ease, which is slow, then fast, and slow. And finally, there's ease in out, which is fast, slow, fast. So those are the different possible functions. And you can set it either by saying transition : like width 2s ease out, or you can just set the transition somewhere else and have transition-timing-function : ease out. Either one of those will work. The other property is the delay, and we could set the transition delay to be a number of seconds. That's the number of seconds before the transition will start. So here we can set the transition delay to 1 second. Now, if we want to do that not just to h1 tags, but to a whole bunch of different things, it's kind of inconvenient to repeat those transition rules over and over and over and over. So CSS3 gives you the ability to create what are called keyframes. Basically, what we can do is we can define an animation, and then we can apply that animation to whatever elements we want. So we do that with the @keyframes selector, and that basically says that we're making something that isn't actually part of the web page. We're making sort of an invisible CSS rule that we can then apply to things that are visible. So we can say @keyframes slide_right, and here in curly braces we have to specify a from and a to. And inside more curly braces, after the from and after the to, we specify properties that we want to change. So we're going to go from a left of 10% to a left of 20%. So what this is going to do, it's going to take whatever element we have, and it's going to animate it from going from 10% position from the left to being positioned 20% from the left. So it's going to move it to the right. And so how would I use that? Well, here I've created another CSS rule, div hashtag slider. That's going to match only div tags, and it'll only match them if their ID is slider. And so we can apply the slide right animation by saying animation name : slide right. And then I can set the duration of the animation to be 2 seconds. So over the course of 2 seconds, it's going to move from 10% of being on the left to 20% of being on the left. I could also have a rule that says, okay, find h1 tags that are in the wobble class. That's h1.wobble with no spaces. And I can apply the same animation name slide right. But I can give it an animation duration now of 5 seconds, so it's slower. And I can set a delay, so animation delay of 10 seconds. That means that the animation isn't going to start right away. The page will load, and then all of the wobble H1s will slide to the right after 10 seconds. Instead of using from and to, I can actually use what are called checkpoints. So I could make a transition that goes, it does one thing at 0% of time, and then 50% of the duration of the animation, and then something else at 100%. So it's going to start, in this case, by setting the left property to 10%, and then it's going to slowly change it to being 70% from the left. At the same time, it's going to change the color to red. But as it's going from 10% to the left to 70% to the left, it's going to pass through 60%. So when we're half done with the animation, it'll be at 60%. And then for the last half of the animation, it's only going to grow slowly to 70%. So for the first 50%, it's going to go from 10 to 60, and then it's going to go from 60 to 70. Also, when it gets halfway done with the animation, it'll turn blue. And then for the next half of the animation, it'll slowly turn from blue to red. Another thing that we can do with CSS3 is use what are called media queries. So what is this about? Well, one of the things they wanted to address in CSS3 was this transition that's taking place from desktop computers to mobile devices, tablets and smartphones. And if I'm using a tiny smartphone, I have a tiny screen that might even not have a very high resolution. Today we have mobile phones that have really nice resolution screens. But in 2014, we hadn't quite got there yet. There were a lot of devices that had like 800 by 600 resolution, which wasn't very good. And so if you tried to pull up a web page that was designed to be displayed on a desktop monitor, this big screen, it wouldn't look very good on your phone, and it might be really hard to interact with. So in particular, if I've got my phone and I'm looking at a web page that was designed for a big screen, I'm going to have to do a lot of scrolling to get to information. So it might be the case that I want to have really a completely different interface to my website for people who are on mobile devices than if I'm on a desktop system. So in the CSS2 world, there was a solution for that. You could make what was called an @media rule. Just like we had @keyframe, we could do @media. And it looked sort of like this. You could say @media print, curly brace, and in between the curly braces, you could say like font size 24 points. And then you could say @media screen, and you could have curly braces, font size 12 points. And basically, @media is what's called a decorator. You could put it in front of any CSS rule, and it would basically make that CSS rule only apply if you were on, say, a printer, right? So if we were printing the web page, it would look one way, but if we were displaying it on a screen, it would look different. So here, it's going to print a 24-point font, but on the screen, it's only going to be 12 points. And the @media tag was useful. It had a couple different options. There was print and screen and desktop, I think, was one. But it wasn't widely used because it didn't give you really fine-grained control, and it was hard to decide when one of the media rules would actually apply. So there were a lot of drawbacks to it. But in CSS3, they've really expanded it. So suppose that I'm on a mobile device. Instead of just saying @media mobile or whatever it would be, I can actually have different rules for different types of mobile devices. So, for example, I can say @media all and set sort of a default font size to be 12 points. But then I can do this. I can say @media screen and then in parentheses I can say min width : 480 pixels. So if I am on a device that has a big screen, a screen that has a minimum width of 480 pixels, which I hope all of them do these days, but hey, it's an example. I could set the font size to be larger. I could set a font size of 48 points. But if I'm on something else that doesn't have 480 pixels across, well, then I can use a smaller font. That's the idea. So media queries are great. Transitions are fun and can give you really neat animations. But to access all of these different new properties, you sometimes have to prefix your property with some of these experimental browser prefixes. So -webkit, -ms, -mos, and -o are some of those browser-specific property prefixes. CSS3 provides all sorts of neat transformations, translations, rotations, scaling, and the ability to skew. It also provides transitions for animation, and you can animate pretty much any CSS property, from width to color to font size to position on the screen. You know, position relative and left and right. You can wiggle stuff around. And you can use media queries to adapt to different kinds of devices. Hope you're doing well with your projects. I'll talk to you in the next lecture.